Hi, my name is Arjun Chaudhary, and welcome to Energize, the Tech Revolution. Today, we have a very special guest amongst us. David CARSCADDEN is founder of Blue Harp Consulting Corporation, a boutique energy and sustainability consulting firm based in Calgary. He founded the company in 2020 after working several years in the renewable energy industry as a project developer, project manager, and sales. Originally from Ontario, David moved to Alberta in 2017 and has spent more than a decade working in Canada's renewable energy and energy storage industries. Outside of Canada, David has developed solar energy projects in the USA and Bermuda and has learned industry best practices for development from his experiences in different jurisdictions. Welcome to the show, David.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Arjun, for having me on. I'm
Yeah,
excited.
absolutely, David. David, let's start off by learning a little bit more about your educational journey. Now, you have a Bachelor's of Environment from the University of Waterloo. What got you inspired to pursue an education in the field of environment?
Well, I would say this kind of goes back a little bit to my childhood. I spent time outdoors a lot and I lived in the countryside, so I was always very interested in just the natural environment of where we live and or where I lived in Ontario. And then when I was applying to universities, I applied to I think about four university programs with which were environmental related, and two were related to business. And then I ended up picking the one program out of that group that was kind of a bit of a mixture of both, of business and environment. So I've been interested in the environment for a long time. And I was, in university, I took a lot of courses related to environmental studies, such as ecology and, geographic information systems and these sort of things. So it was quite interesting.
That's amazing to hear, David, that your passion for environment was there right from early on. Now, in terms of your professional journey, David, you started off in the field of solar energy consulting before founding your own company, Blue Harp Consulting. Now, would love to learn more about your professional journey and what inspired you to found your own company.
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess it starts maybe a little bit before I started as a solar energy consultant. Before that, as a university student, I was in a co-op program. University of Waterloo has a very good co-op program, so it gives you the opportunity to work in the industries that you're interested in. And I was lucky enough to get a job working at a solar energy company that was very focused on doing commercial and residential rooftop solar in Ontario under the microfit and the feed-in tariff programs at the time. So it was about 2011. And that job during that co-op term allowed me to get a job shortly after I graduated university, working for someone who I actually worked with at the time. And so that kind of got me a job as a solar energy consultant. And I spent a couple of years managing, maybe and selling about 60 to 70 residential solar systems in Ontario. And that included, I was probably doing more, I probably did about 100 or so site assessments. So I'd go to the people's homes and meet with them, explain the program and explain how a system might look on the roof and that and take measurements. And so I was getting involved a lot in quite a number of different projects kind of across Ontario. And then I started thinking it would be great to maybe focus on some larger scale projects, maybe the utility scale sector. So after a couple of years working in that kind of smaller scale project size, I got a job at Saturn Power in Kitchener or Baden, Ontario, rather. And I worked as a project developer for about 4 years. And I guess over that time, I learned and quite a bit about the industry across different provinces, the US as well. We were working on projects kind of all over the place. So I was learning different strategies and project tasks that you have to focus on in different regions. And one of the big parts of my roles was creating partnerships and trying to find contracts for the company. So I spent a lot of time networking and going to events and getting to know other people in the industry. And then there was a certain point where I was thinking, maybe it would be a good time to start consulting with different groups. And that's when I started Blue Harp Consulting. So that was about 5 years ago now.
Such an amazing story right from the start of your co-op days and now being an owner of an organization. Amazing to hear that, David. Now, would love
Thank
to
you.
learn more about Blue Harp Consulting. What are the services your organization offers and where are your office is located?
Sure. So yeah, we're an energy and sustainability consulting company. We offer general consulting services in those two sectors or spaces. And a lot of our work involves early stage project origination, siting, helping developers or our clients figure out maybe where good sites could be for renewable energy projects or energy storage projects. We've also been getting involved more and more in the kind of the clean tech space, where we're working with technology companies and helping them, in most cases, integrate their technologies into Canada somewhere. So we're working with international companies kind of overseas, trying to help them expand here. Our services are pretty general though, so it just depends on who we're working with, what we can provide. We do a lot of regulatory and stakeholder work for some of the larger projects that we work on, and we do a lot of planning and strategy creation as well for companies and organizations.
Amazing
And,
to hear. Go ahead. Sorry, David.
oh no, go ahead.
Now, I said amazing to hear that. I mean, the whole array of services that your organization offers. I understand that your organization has worked in both projects in USA and in Canada. Now, I would love to learn the types of projects specifically in the states you worked in specific states in USA and also in the specific provinces in Ontario. And what's the difference between USA and Canada?
Well, there's quite a few differences between the US and Canada. I think generally a project, a renewable energy project, is going to have a lot of the same major tasks and requirements, activities that need to be done. You need your permits, you need to do the engineering and design work, you need to have a willing landowner for the project to be sited on. So there's a lot of things that go on that's very similar across the two countries. But then once you get down to the state level, there's a lot of different, changes that need to be made to how you do projects, and it can vary quite a bit between state and also between the US and Canada. And even within Canada, every province there's a different jurisdiction and different authority that kind of governs renewable energy projects. So a project can look quite different between two different provinces. However, there's generally the same kind of bulk major activities like interconnection studies that need to be done and that.
In terms of your experiences in both, the states and in Canada, what are the specific states in USA and the provinces in Canada where the timelines are longer and the process are a bit more complex based on your experiences?
Yeah, I guess it's hard to compare exactly the provinces and states, but there's some jurisdictions that are a little bit more regulated, which often take longer to do projects in. In the U.S., like Washington State is quite a regulated province. There's a lot of environmental features to the geography there that are very important. A lot of sensitive species, so you really have to think a lot about that. That takes a long time to get those necessary permits. Whereas, a state like Texas, for example, you can generally move a little bit quicker than some of your more heavily regulated states. And then in Canada, it's somewhat similar in a way. Like different provinces are a little bit more intense on the permitting side of things. Saskatchewan, for example, is not overly complicated to advance a project as long as you have a power purchase agreement with SAS Power in most cases. But you don't necessarily need that either to develop projects in Saskatchewan. And then you look at Alberta, and the regulatory timeline is getting longer and longer. So, at one point it was maybe a fairly quick place to develop projects, and now it's taking longer, and the timelines are slowing down.
Thanks so much for sharing that, David. Now, I understand that one of your specialities is project development in renewable energy. Now, for the benefit of our viewers and listeners, could you describe the distinction between the functional role of a project developer versus the functional role of a project manager in the realm of renewable energy?
Right. Yeah, this is a good question, I would say. Project developers and project managers, there's a lot of very similar aspects and project functions, role function that you need to factor in when you're a project manager. You need to be quite organized. Same with the project developer, you need to be very organized. As a project manager, you need to have good communication skills, and I would say the same thing for project developers. I think maybe project developers need to have even maybe slightly more communication or maybe more advanced communication skills in some ways, specifically when you're talking to stakeholders. I think that's where it comes down to it. And project managers sometimes do have those interactions with stakeholders too, so that they obviously need to have great communication skills too. But I think that's one of the key differences is maybe you just need to focus a little bit more on the communication when you're developing projects, because when you have to explain a project to the regulators and you have to apply for permits, you really need to have a good handle on how stakeholders view your project, because there can be a lot of delays and challenges if your stakeholders aren't aware of your project in a certain way. Um, so I mean that's just one difference, but I think project managers, they need to have a good control of the budget and the schedule, and I would say the same thing for project developers. So I do think there's a lot of similarities between the two roles, definitely.
Makes sense, David. Now let us dive deep into the functional role of project developer, which is essentially the theme of this podcast episode. And we'll be exploring these 4 to 5 categories separately. These categories would be firstly, site selection and land control. Secondly, permitting. Thirdly, interconnection. Fourthly, power purchase agreements. And then we'll also touch upon engineering, design, procurement, and construction handover. Does that sound like a plan to you?
Yes, absolutely.
Great, David. So, firstly, let's dive deep into site selection and land control. So, what exactly is the role of a project developer in this specific category, and what are the stakeholders that they interact with?
Right. I would say the project developer is involved kind of right at the start, typically, right when the land is being chosen and negotiated an agreement for. So there's a lot of key people you're talking to at this stage, and really it would be your landowners or perhaps a land agent. Sometimes project developers work more with a land agent. The land agent actually meets with the landowner, and so the project developer is very aware of that kind of landowner communication. And then, at early stage, there's also some communication with, legal departments, lawyers. When you're negotiating agreements, you need to have them involved. Um, at the land acquisition stage, there's not as much financial kind of considerations that need to be considered. Usually it's, you kind of have your preset budget of what you can spend on your land acquisition, and then you have that set. And sometimes the landowners will obviously negotiate, and you'll have to go back and make sure that's within the budget, of course. So you're maybe sometimes interacting with the finance team, but usually it's just your key focus is the landowner, and sometimes the municipality that you're working in, you're starting to engage in some of these other external parties and stakeholders.
So let's say, David, you are approaching a specific landowner to build a specific renewable energy project in their land. You're trying to educate them about the benefits of your specific renewable energy project. Now, simultaneously, there are 4 to 5 other developers who are approaching the same landowner to educate them on the benefits of their project. What is the unique value proposition that you bring, or your communication style in terms of education to the landowner, that they choose to develop that 15 to 25 relationship with you specifically rather than, other developers?
Right. I think it goes, we focus most on education. I think we want to make sure the landowners understand what they're getting into. So we try to educate them not only on the agreement, like the lease agreement, but really what the project's going to look like and what the schedule might look like. Um, Ideally, kind of showing them pictures and getting, trying to educate them as much as possible about what the project is going to look like. And but not just the project itself, how it interacts with the overall electricity system, for example. So we want them to understand kind of how their project is even, operating to some level of, detail. So I think that's where we would kind of differentiate. Is I think we're very focused on educating them to the point where they are almost like understanding kind of the whole development of what it's going to look like before they really make the decision to lease their land or sell their land potentially.
Totally makes sense, David. So let's say now this land has been acquired. The next step is permitting. Now, could you describe what are the different types of permitting that is needed, and what is that level of permitting needed, whether it's at a state level, federal level, local level? Would love to learn more on that.
Sure. So permitting is very site specific, even between two projects of the same technology. So, for example, two solar projects or two wind projects. If you're in one county versus another county, different zone land, everything's going to change a little bit. So yeah, I think permitting is definitely something that's very site specific. So until you have an exact location, it's really hard to say all the different permits. But really, there's usually the major ones are the provincial level permits that you need, and usually that comes in the way of the regulatory authority. So, for example, in Alberta, it's the Alberta Utilities Commission. You need that permit to build your facility. In Saskatchewan, there's something similar but different. So there's different authorities that you need permits from, and then there's usually the Ministry of Environment in every province. Also, would have some level of permit that they need to provide you with. And then there's the more local permits like the municipal permits, the development permit, building permits, a lot of those that are required. So it really depends on where you are. But usually there's and the federal permits are sometimes only required on certain sites, certain scales, even I guess in some cases. But usually, federal permits aren't necessarily always involved in a project.
So David, I understand that the type of permits and the number of permits is all depend on the site and the jurisdiction that you're applying to. But based
Mhm.
on your experiences, what is the typical timeline to get these approvals and permits from these necessary regulatory bodies?
Yeah, it depends on the renewable energy technology or energy storage, for example. Battery timelines might look a little bit different. But usually, I would suggest on a solar facility, it's usually 2 years minimum that you're going to need to get those permits. It's possible you could get it maybe quicker in certain places, certain provinces, but I would say 2 to 3 years is probably a reasonable timeline. And then some of the bigger projects like wind developments, hydro developments, those are often going to be 3, 5, 5 years even sometimes, or possibly longer, depending on the site.
Thanks so much, David. That's very helpful. Now, once this permitting has been approved and you've received all these permits, before moving on to the interconnection and the power purchase agreement stage, let us briefly touch upon the design and engineering stage. Is it safe to say that once the permitting has been acquired successfully, that's when the EPC company comes in and starts doing the engineering and design work?
I would say the permitting, sorry, not the permitting, the interconnection, sorry, the design work and engineering work can be done really at any point. You can't really finalize it, of course, until you have well, you can actually finalize it before you necessarily get your permits. But I would say usually the early design does start quite early, even as you're kind of applying for your permits. Because sometimes you need a project layout to be shown to the authorities. So you're going to need to do some design work to make it, you know, able to communicate your project a little bit better visually. So you're going to need maps. So there is a fair bit of work that goes into the design and engineering kind of early on, even as you're applying or before you're applying to your permits. But you're likely not going to create a stamped drawing package until you've got probably most of your permits and you kind of know the project is this is where it's going to be and this is how it's been approved.
Totally makes sense, David. And as far as your role as a project developer, what is the level of your contribution in terms of technical discussions and technical design with the EPC company? How technically involved are you in these projects?
Well, me personally, I'm not overly technical. I'm not an engineer or any sort of technical designation. So my involvement as a project developer might be different than another project developer who might be, for example, here. Or they might be quite a bit more involved in those technical discussions. I do have an awareness of the technical, nature of projects, and I would say as a project developer like myself, then I do get involved and participate, but I'm not necessarily helping to steer the electrical design of the facility. And you know, I need to understand it so that I can help develop the project in other areas.
So totally makes sense, David. Now, as this engineering work is progressing, let's move on to the interconnection process. Now, could you describe what exactly is interconnection? Who is the interconnection application submitted to, and what is the purpose and the timeline? Would love to learn more on that.
Right. So the interconnection is basically you're looking at your project, your solar or wind farm. You need to connect it into the electricity grid. So the interconnection authority in Alberta, it's the Alberta Electricity System Operator. In Ontario, it's the Independent Electricity System Operator. They need to be able to physically connect your facility into the wider grid or the distribution or the transmission network, wherever you're connecting to. And that needs there's significant amount of studies that need to go into that and technical engineering related studies. So It's quite a complicated process, and it needs to be done regardless of what state or province you're working in. It's always going to be a factor. Unless you're, of course, completely off grid and you're working on something, then you just need to connect into the facility. Um, so yeah, the interconnection process is quite a long process. It can often take a couple of years minimum in most cases, even sometimes several years. And certain, jurisdictions are quicker at studying these and kind of moving projects through the interconnection. It's getting more and more complicated right now in the industry, in the Canada and the US, because of how many renewables and battery facilities are being connected into the grid or trying to be connected. So interconnection timelines are beginning to kind of slow down in some places, especially Alberta.
I see, David. And now, let's say, for example, you're building a project in Alberta and you're submitting an interconnection application to ASO. Typically, like how big are these initial applications that it takes to register an interconnection, application with ASO? Is it like a 200-page document, 100-page, 5-page?
Well, in Alberta, it's not overly like the initial application is not a necessarily a long document. It's really just kind of a short application that needs to be done typically through the distribution system operator or the transmission system operator. You're kind of applying to with them to the ISO. And those initial applications are not overly complicated. They do cost, some money in the few thousands of dollars range. And then, as you go along, once your project is in the queue, then you're starting to incur more costs and you have much more information you need to provide. So the studies get a fair bit longer that need to be done.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David. Now, once this interconnection has been approved, we move on to power purchase agreements. Obviously, the electricity that the solar panels, wind turbines are producing, there has to be an off-taker or somebody who's purchasing and using this electricity. That's where these power purchase agreements come into place. So, could you describe what is your role as a project developer in this power purchase agreement phenomena?
Right. So our involvement, as Blue Harp Consulting, we do support with our clients, helping them acquire power purchase agreements, helping them negotiate power purchase agreements. And eventually we'd like to be working on the utility side and helping them also do the same, like negotiating and securing power purchase agreements. But right now we work with the renewable developers typically to help them acquire these documents. So that's our involvement.
How challenging is the negotiation phase of power purchase agreements? And typically, how long of a power purchase agreement do you acquire? Is it like 15 to 25 years? Would love to learn more on that.
Sure. Yeah, the negotiations can take a while. It can take a couple years sometimes in some cases, and they're usually quite lengthy legal documents, 100 plus pages in most cases. Sometimes you can negotiate them much quicker if maybe there isn't a lot of room to negotiate and this is kind of a take it or leave it document. Like sometimes in some of the provinces, some of the utilities, they issue RFPs and then they award like kind of a designated power purchase agreement. And they say, here it is. Sometimes you can make changes, have some comments to it. But those ones can get negotiated a lot quicker. But a lot of times it can take a couple of years, potentially, and then it's quite a legal process.
And once this negotiation is complete and a power purchase agreement has been established, what is the duration of these power purchase agreements? Is it 10 years, 20 years, 5 years?
Usually they're about 20 years, I would say. That's pretty typical of renewable energy projects. Sometimes 25 years for wind is quite a common timeline. And for some of the longer term assets like hydro facilities, those can be even longer.
I see. I see. That helps, David. Now, once this power purchase agreement has been acquired, we move on to the procurement stage where you're procuring all these massive, wind turbines or solar panels or battery energy storage systems. What is your specific involvement as a project developer in the procurement phase?
Yeah, it's usually being aware of the procurement and what needs to be procured, and working with the engineering teams or the design teams to help figure out what equipment could be required. Required, and you have to understand kind of what the timelines are going to be, and you need to be able to communicate that throughout the project development. So it's maybe not necessarily the project developer's job typically to support too much with procurement. I guess it depends on the company as well. Like every organization is different and then develop project in different ways. But I would say usually it's just understanding what are the long lead items. You know, the transformers typically are long lead items. Some types of cables can be, you know, becoming longer lead items. Um, the solar modules or the wind turbines, those are going to be long lead items, of course. And so you just have to understand it and try to help, manage the project along and try to limit any sort of procurement risks early on.
Makes total sense, David. Now, while this procurement phase is underway, comes into the picture the construction project manager who you are handing over this project to, from the project development phase to the project management and project construction phase. Now, what is that handover process look like? What are the conversations that you have with the construction project manager? Would love to learn more on that.
Yeah, definitely the longer the transition happens or the handoff happens, the longer period, I think the better and the more smooth it can go. Oftentimes, if you're kind of handing things over like in a 1 day kind of thing or a very short time, it can be maybe a bit tricky and challenging and have some risk involved. But usually, excuse me, usually, ideally, you want it to be over a longer time period. So you can work very closely with the construction manager, project manager, make sure they understand the project and how it's gotten to where it is. And then, eventually they're going to maybe rely on you for certain things. But really, you kind of do that handoff as as easy as you can, but it can take a bit of time, definitely.
For sure, David. Now, let's say you hand over this project to the construction manager and construction process has started. It's been maybe like 6 months into the construction process. Is it common for them to come back to you time and time again to ask more questions about the history of the project, or once you've hand over, your job is essentially done in that project?
It's pretty typical for there not to be too much for you to do afterwards. The project is developed and it's in construction. I mean, it's pretty rare, I would say, for myself, anyways, as a project developer, to get too involved. Like sometimes you might be required to update a stakeholder or maybe have a conversation with the landowner about something you know, something like that. But it's usually quite minimal, from my experience.
Thanks for sharing that, David. Now, lastly, there are project developers who work in solar technology. There are project developers who work in battery energy storage systems, wind turbines. How common is it for project developers to work on all three technologies simultaneously, or do you become like a specialist project developer in a specialist renewable energy technology?
Well, I guess it's becoming more common for there to be multi technologies involved in maybe a certain project or a certain organization might be doing more different technologies. So I think it's becoming more common. We're not necessarily focused on any one technology really, so we're supporting in lots of different areas. Um, yeah, hopefully, does that answer your question?
Yes,
Or
yes, absolutely. So the skills from technology to technology is transferable for a project developer. Makes
yeah, sorry, I would say so. Yeah, I think it's pretty transferable. I think it's just a matter of, different tasks need to be done, different permits might be required. So you have to go down a different path in the end, but it's very transferable because you're doing kind of the same thing for, the interconnection piece and the power purchase agreement. They all need these things. So not much changes in that regard.
Absolutely, David. Now, lastly, David, you're such a successful, leader in the renewable energy space and a specialist in project development. For somebody who's looking to, develop their career in the field of project development in renewable energy, what sort of top three attributes or skill sets would you recommend to them to be successful in this field?
Thanks. Yeah, I would say definitely attention to detail is a very important it's an important skill and important trait, I think, for probably most careers out there. But definitely for renewable energy project developers, I think there's a lot that you need to look at and be aware of. And when you're working on regulatory applications, it's very important you have extreme attention to detail because, in Alberta, for example, when the AUC is looking at applications, they're looking at it. There's a whole team of people looking at it, and they're all very experienced people within the industry, and they know, how to spot, potential errors. And if you're not having strong attention to detail with your application, for example, to the regulatory authorities, that's going to make it very challenging to do your projects. You might have to get involved in a hearing, and you know, anyway. So, long story short, I think attention to detail is definitely a key skill. And then I think strong research skills I think is becoming more important. I think as things get more complicated, in the energy sector, more more risks out there, and more things that need to be done to build a project, and more permits you need. I think you need to make sure you're researching properly kind of ahead of time. So I think that's a great skill set for project developers to have, is strong research abilities. And then, I think I mentioned this earlier, but communication is another big one. I think that's always very, very important for project developers in the renewable space, is being able to communicate in writing, and in email communication, virtually, you know, everything.
Great, David. Thanks for sharing those, those soft skills and those attributes. In terms of, specific softwares or technology or tools that the project developer needs to be familiar, is there any industry standard software that typically project developers work with?
Well, I would say in the US, it might be more common for there to be some tools and softwares, maybe that kind of map out the grid in the US, for example, really well. We don't necessarily have that level. There's not a lot of tools in Canada for those sort of things, I would say. Sometimes they do extend it north to Canada, like some of the companies that have these tools, but in a lot of cases, it's not of accurate information, maybe, and they're not verifying it as much. But um, there's not a lot of great tools, I would say, unfortunately. Hopefully in the future there'll be some more. But there are some mapping softwares and tools that help you kind of look at permits that might be required. It might, and also where the utility lines are, where the gas pipelines are, and kind of where you need to maybe site some of the environmental features as well, and sensitive species habitats. A lot of those are mapped out there. So there are tools like that which are very useful for project developers.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David. So that concludes the formal portion of our interview for today. We like to end our podcast with a fun segment called a rapid fire, where our viewers and listeners get to learn a little bit more about the personal side of our guests. Now, as part of this rapid fire, I'll be asking you three quick questions. Are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
Great, David. So, firstly, as this is a tech podcast, would love to learn what's your favorite app or a hardware product that you enjoy using?
Well, I think my favorite app is, well, I have a few favorite apps. I would say probably they're all sports related. I like the Score app. I like, MLB app, NHL app. I like those apps. So I don't have any crazy cool technology really outside of just that.
Amazing, David. Just a side note there, what's your favorite sport?
I would say baseball is probably my favorite sport. Yeah.
And your favorite team in
Toronto
baseball?
Blue Jays. Yeah.
Toronto Blue Jays. Okay, of course,
Oh
of
yeah.
course.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, David. Secondly, what's a book that you've read that has had a big impact on your life and why?
I would say several years ago I read a book called "There's No Plan B for Your A Game." It's by Bo Eason, and I thought it was a really good book. I've read it, yeah, maybe once or twice. It's been a while since I read it though, and it did have an impact on me. It really helped me, I think, with coming up with goals and creating a kind of a vision for what I want to do in the future. And I think it really helped me just maybe even make decisions. And it's just a really good book, and I would definitely recommend that.
Great, David. And lastly, do you have any final words of wisdom, perhaps a short story or a quote that you'd like to share with members of our audience?
Um, I don't know if it's a quote exactly, but maybe just a real quick story. Well, not really. It's not going to be a great story, but it's a quick story. I would say a few years ago, probably about 7 years ago, maybe now, I went to an event. It was put on by AltaLink, which is one of the main transmission system operators in Alberta, and it was an event for their customers. It was like a customer appreciation event, and it was in downtown Calgary, and there was lots of tables of people, and there was a lunch and everything was great. And they, well, I think it was the CEO was doing kind of an initial kickoff presentation, or just a quick spiel about AltaLink, and he put up a slide that showed how long some of the critical infrastructure in society would have before it would stop working if the power went out. And it was showing, like, for a hospital it was like X number of hours potentially, and all these critical pieces of infrastructure. And it kind of made me realize, wow, electricity is quite important. I never really realized it until that slide that he presented. And then maybe a few years later, I was watching a video of an event. It was like an electricity conference, a national electricity conference, and there was a speaker from the US. I think this was a Canadian event, and then it was a speaker from the US. I think he was part of NERC or FERC maybe, and he was talking about the economy, and he was talking about how important electricity is to the economy, and his quote. I don't have the exact number, and I can't remember it. I'm trying to find this actually online. I just can't find it. I'm gonna figure out who said it, but he said the electricity sector is like it's 7% of the economy of the US, for example. I think maybe it wasn't as high as 7, but it was right around that kind of single digit amount. And then he said, but it's the first 7 in terms of importance. It's like the first because all the other industries kind of rely on it. So I remember that was kind of the second moment that I had where I realized, oh wow, he's saying something. AltaLink's kind of pointing this out to me, kind of helped me realize electricity is very, very critical. And that's we're at Blue Harp Consulting as a company. We're really involved in the electricity sector. So those are two things I guess I just wanted to leave just to highlight.
Thank you, and very well said, David. So that concludes our rapid fire interview for today. What's the best way for our viewers and listeners to get in touch with you?
Yeah, I use LinkedIn. People can contact me on LinkedIn. My name's Dave CARSCADDEN on LinkedIn, and yeah, the email is also good. Yeah, email my business website there, blueharpconsulting.ca. It's also another way.
Great, great, David. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. It was an absolute honor and pleasure having you. And thank you so much for sharing your subject matter expertise in the field of project development and renewable energy. From the team at ENERGIZE, wishing you and the entire team of Blue Hub Consulting lots of growth and lots of success.
Thank you, Arjun. Greatly appreciated.
Absolutely. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, our episode for today. And remember, a greener future is in our hands. I'm Arjun Chaudhary.